Getting the bike access on the Bay Bridge has been a long and sad story, and thanks to some folks who did sort of direct action efforts a few years ago that got a lot more attention, which was a good thing, and seemed to make the point that it wouldn't be that hard to get bicycles on the Bay Bridge. But in fact, it has been hard to get bicycles on the Bay Bridge because there's a giant, monstrous bureaucracy standing in the way who hates bicycles. And for all their protestations that they care and they want to accommodate cycles on the local bridges, they really don't. And they don't want to do anything that reduces car access or in any way, in their mind, impedes traffic. And so we're left with a peculiar situation in which we're going to have a half a bridge someday, maybe. I assume they will really open it to bicycles when they open the eastern span, and they'll let us ride all the way to Treasure Island or to your Point Island. But at that point, what are we supposed to do? Get off and walk, catch a shuttle or whatever they think they're going to do for us. So they need to make an accommodation on the west span. And there's a lot of really obvious things. I mean, the history of the Bay Bridge is a double-decker bridge on the west span that once upon a time had cars on the top deck and 3 lanes of trucks on the bottom deck and two train lanes, heavy-duty train lanes. And so their claim that they can't easily hang something off the side of the bridge because of the weight has all been disproved by engineering studies by people who care. And they don't really even have to spend the however ridiculous amount of money they say it's going to cost us, $700-800 million. It's just like, what? All along they've had this real hostility to accommodating bicycles, and so every time they finally start to cave into the necessity of making space for bikes, they make a point of saying, but it's so expensive, in order to really make the bicycles lose political capital in the general population. Like, why are we spending all this money on so few people who ride a bike? Well, don't do it. Give us a lane. It's very cheap. Put up a little barricade along one of the lanes, narrow the other lanes so you can still have 5 lanes of cars, just make them narrower. Make the speed limit 30 miles an hour on the Bay Bridge on the west span. Wouldn't be that different than it is today. Most people riding across the Bay Bridge most of the time are going 30 miles an hour because you can't go any faster because there's too much traffic. So want to get a lot of people out of their cars? Make it easy to get across the bridge some other way, preferably on a bicycle or on foot. So someday they'll probably get it together, but the people that are actually making the decisions and allocating the resources and the money are in some ways caught up in what we might call a culture war, because there's no objective or rational reason not to do this. It's all because they are just genuinely hostile to the growing population that has embraced the bicycle and sees the bicycle as a better way of moving around in urban environments and thinks it's an intelligent choice to make as an individual, even though the entire infrastructure of the culture is dead set against it and actually threatens your life. So plenty of people won't ride a bike because it's too scary. And if you are a daily cyclist, as I am and many people are, and if you've done it for many years, you realize it's very safe. It's much safer than riding around in a car. But for those who've never tried it or have just tried it a little bit and they aren't used to the space that you have available and how to make best use of that space on a cycle, it's scary. And it makes it difficult for people to choose to start bicycling. And so for that to happen in large numbers, more than already the large numbers that have started anyway, we need to have infrastructure.
So why do you think there's that resistance?
Well, I think that there's a long-term logic that sort of has to do with this crazy notion of the American way of life. And the American way of life since World War II has been based on interstate highways, private automobiles, and suburbia. And since around the late 70s and early 80s, there's been a return to the city by a lot of folks who had originally, the white flight reversed itself, and there's been a white in-flight into the center city, which has been hand in hand with a process of real estate inflation. And we've lived through a 30, 40-year bubble of real estate inflation and asset inflation in general. And so that economic process has been part of what's now changing our sense of urban life and city life over time. And you have this new phenomenon now, populations that have come in who really are trying to reinvent how we live here. They're relocalizing agriculture, thinking about bicycles and pedestrian rights instead of just moving cars through the city as fast as possible. The whole concept of level of services under attack is an absurd way of gauging environmental health and anything else for that matter, except what it says it does, which is move cars as fast as possible. So this transition that's underway is actually seen as a cultural threat by the people who built that previous world. Like they think that the way life should be organized is through private property, private car ownership, and the domination of the market through basically you as an individual in society have two things you have to do: work and shop, which are two sides of the same coin. And everything else that doesn't get measured by dollars is irrelevant. So all cultural expressions, all activities that are not directly measurable as generating of revenue, of money, they actually don't care about them. And they actually see them as a threat, because if you don't have access to public space and you don't have access to these other kinds of activities that you do for free with your friends in the city, what are you left to do? Buy things. Go to places where all there is to do is buy a drink and consume entertainment commodities for a price at the door. That's what most people are doing most of the time anyway. And a bunch of us on the bicycle have found out that we can actually create a different kind of life outside of that logic more easily. The bicycle is just a piece of the puzzle. It's not the only piece by any means. But it's been helpful in facilitating some of those spaces opening up. And I think that the people who run this culture, even though they'll never admit it because they want to co-opt the bicycle and say, okay, that's a good idea, we need to worry about global warming, and we need to worry about pollution, and we need to worry about congested traffic, so yeah, we want that 10% of the population who's willing to bicycle, so yeah, we'll give you some minor concessions around that. But the idea that it's actually the cutting edge of a deeper transformation of life is what is the threat. And it might not be, let's face it, we might just be bicycling and it might not amount to anything else, and not much to say about it if that's true. But if it is a bigger transformation underway and the bicycle is just the front edge of that, then you see why there's a culture war that burbles around it all the time, and why bureaucrats who are essentially beholden to the existing industrial apparatus, asphalt, cars, bridges, the oil industry, etc., agribusiness, massive water diversion schemes, all these kinds of ways of organizing modern industrial life, they see the bicycle as a threat to that, even though it probably isn't in and of itself. But it is if it's part of a larger cultural transformation that's underway, which some of us are obviously pushing. Mm-hmm. San Francisco, we have the Bike Coalition, which is, to me, one of the most tepid organizations around, who will never stand very far out front on anything. They always take the cautious position on everything. And they're really only interested in this narrow question of bicycling infrastructure because they want to have this huge membership and budget and everything that allows, they can only get by having a non-radical position about bicycling. They're quite convinced that were they more radical, they would lose members. And they're probably right, because a lot of their members are really conservative. And so, you know, they have managed to gain some minor infrastructural changes in the city, which they consider enormous changes, enormous improvements. And I'm like, no, they're not.